Hi everyone, it's Philip Grindell from Defuse Global. So at Defuse Global, we are tackling targeted and toxic behaviours that are directed predominantly toward private and corporate clients. What I thought I'd do today is look at this latest case that's been in the British media and is really capturing everyone's attention. It's the case of the Southport triple killer. So here we have a young man who committed a horrendous crime, killing 3 young girls who were at a Taylor Swift party, about a party with dancing and what have you, and he went in there and killed them and injured some other people. There's been lots and lots of media speculation, there's been lots and lots of criticism, and this morning the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, gave a press conference where he acknowledged there were some significant mistakes. Now, what I want to do in this next few minutes is just look at this case from the outside, through the perspective, through the lens of behavioural threat assessment and management. Because that's what we do, that's what we specialise in at Defuse. It's important to say, I don't have any inside information. I'm only really relying on what's in the media, what I've read in the papers, what I've heard in the news. But there is some interesting material there, and I think there's enough there to say some issues were potentially missed. So for those of you who are unaware of behavioural threat assessment and management, in very simple terms, it's about identifying the threat that people pose based on their behaviours, but also based on identified behavioural trends. So things that we know that other people have done, and some really eminent scientists have, research analysts, forensic psychologists, etc., have identified specific behaviours that suggest someone's escalating towards violence. As a side note, all of this is going to be published in my book, which comes out very soon in the next week or two, which is called Personal Threat Management. But for the purposes of this, let's look at it. There are 2 real key elements to this. One is there are what they call the indicators. And there are a number of these indicators, but at least 3, maybe even 4 of those indicators are prevalent in this specific case. Now, I'm not a forensic psychologist, I'm a security specialist, and I'm looking at this as a security specialist. There will be forensic psychologists working with this young man over the next few years, looking to really understand the motivation, the thought process, etc., that he went through before he committed this act. And I'm sure they're going to do some brilliant work. There'll be forensic psychologists watching this that will have greater insight into some of these issues than I do. But what we need to look at is this young man was identified at a very young age as having some problems. He was expelled from school, and we'll talk about that in a moment, and then subsequently on 3 separate occasions referred to an organisation within the UK terrorism process, which is there to identify and divert people who are, in their view, on the way to committing terrorist acts. And this is where I think the first mistake has been made. So if we look at it, we know that when he went to prevent, they suggested there was no evidence of him being driven by any ideological motivation in terms of a terrorist ideological motivation. And I agree, there doesn't appear to be any evidence of that, but there is evidence of some different and more concerning, perhaps, ideologies. So when we're looking at this from a threat perspective, we're looking at from the pre-attack indicators, or the proximal indicators. And the first one we come up against is what's called the pathway to violence. It was a process that my good friend Ted Calhoun and his colleague came up with, and there are a number of stages that you can go through it. So what we're saying is these people don't just snap and attack; they follow a process. They brood. They think about things, and they dwell, and then they plan what they're going to do. They don't just snap and react. And the first phase of that is grievance. And this is where I think we've come into some challenges, because what the Prevent programme we're looking at doing is identifying, does he have a terrorist ideology? And the answer is no, he doesn't. What he does have is a very, very significant grievance. And those grievances we can look at from what's published may have started from when he was a very young boy, where he says that he was racially abused at school. And in fact, when he was 13, I think it's about 2019, he actually phoned up Childline to say that he was being racially bullied at school and he was going to take a knife to school as protection. That resulted in a number of processes, but one of them was that he was expelled from school. So if he has a grievance, which is that he's being racially abused, that can create a grievance. There is evidence of that. There's evidence that he called Childline, so we know that he had that issue. There is evidence that he was bullied at school. Now, when you're bullied, particularly if you're publicly bullied, often an emotion that is accompanied with that is one of shame, humiliation. And we know that humiliation is one of the 4 component parts of a grievance. And in fact, shame has been known as the universal motivator. So could this be the cause of his grievance? This humiliation, this shame. He also, if you've been bullied and excluded from school, he may have felt very isolated. Now, we know also that he's been subsequently diagnosed on the autism spectrum. And whilst that is not necessarily a contributing factor to anything he's done, it may be a contributing factor to why he felt so isolated. So maybe his grievance is this feeling of isolation from his peers or from society, be it on racial grounds or others. We know that his background is his family came from Rwanda. If you know the history of Rwanda, where it is 2 separate factions literally slaughtering each other around this, does that feed into some of his forms of grievance? Now, when a grievance can't be resolved, what often happens then in these circumstances is that the person forms a violent ideation. In other words, I can't resolve my grievance. The only way I'm going to deal with it is by being violent. Now, we know that he has a previous for this particular behaviour. We know when he was 13, he talked about taking a knife to school. So therefore, he's already thinking about violence. We also know that after he was excluded from school, he actually turned up at school and attacked one of his former bullies with a hockey stick, and I think he broke his wrist. So we've already got some previous behavioural evidence here that what he does when he's feeling in a way to resolve his grievance is he resolves into violence. So we can see that he's got this violent ideation. Again, we don't know, and I don't know what was going on behind the closed doors of his family, what the situation was there, whether violence was a part of their lives or not. We might make some assessment around if his family come from Rwanda. Did he grow up hearing the stories of what was going on in Rwanda? And did that create some interest or some preconception around violence? Because the next bit is research and planning. The next bit on his escalation to violence. So what we do know is that he actually planned to attack his school. The previous week he had made plans to do that, and his father actually stopped him doing that. So we know that there was some research and planning. If he's going to attack his school, a school that he knows, then his research may not be that detailed because he already knows where he's going. He planned it, but we know that he booked a taxi to take him from home to the school. So there's evidence of planning there. In terms of the actual attack, there's no evidence of anything there at this stage. So was there a random attack following the thwarting of his original plan? Or was it something to do with what's often called target dispersal? Which means quite often people who are targeting somebody will have other targets they'll look at. When we looked at some of the MPs and members of Parliament in the UK that were targeted and attacked, very often we saw evidence of this where they actually had multiple targets, but they ended up zoning in on the one they attacked. At this stage, we don't know too much about that, but hopefully that we'll know more about that in the years to come. At the moment, he's not, as I understand it, been particularly communicative, but that may change over the years. So what about pre-attack behaviour? Well, we know that he acquired a weapon. He got his knife, the knife that he actually attacked with. But also he got ricin. Now that's not something that you just kind of buy off the shelves. It's something that's quite difficult to do. It's particularly difficult to do without flagging up all sorts of systems and processes that will alert the terrorism network. But somehow he managed to do that. So there's a good deal of pre-attack preparation there. Quite what he was going to do with that ricin, I don't know. But the fact he's acquired it demonstrates a degree of preparation and planning. We then go on to the probing and breaching section. Again, he knew his school really well. There would be no real element of that. The school didn't have any security. In the UK, particularly, we don't have those sort of securities that you might do in the US, for instance. So he wouldn't have had to breach any particular security. And certainly the actual the attack he carried out, again, there was nothing to particularly breach, open a door and walk in. So that bit isn't particularly relevant. And of course, he then did the attack. So there is some evidence there of this clear pathway to violence. One of the other indicators that's been talked about is his fixation, often called an obsession. And we know that he had a real fixation on violence, particularly with weapons. But he'd also looked at, obviously, his family's history in Rwanda, a very violent war that took place there, which culminated in his family coming to the UK. We also know that he looked and studied in great detail organisations like the IRA, Gaddafi, Al-Qaeda. He had an Al-Qaeda manual with him or on his possession at home. So we know that he'd studied these, and there's evidence of this being identified quite early on of his obsession with violence. The problem is we don't know what they did with that, because they clearly didn't cure it or didn't thwart it. But that fixation is another red flag. That's another indicator of someone who's escalating towards violence. Accompanying that is the behaviour of identification. And again, this goes back to his emulating his obsession with violent attackers who he studied. So he'd looked at, he'd researched, he'd studied all these people that carry out these violent attacks. That is a red flag, a big red flag, particularly for a young man of his age. Now, one of the things that's been talked about is the lack of threats, the lack of any communicated threats. He didn't threaten anyone. And it's important to recognise that actually directly communicated threats is a very, very low indicator of an attack, of an escalating threat. So we know, for instance, that directly communicated threats are actually quite rare, and when they do happen, they're a poor indicator, as I've said, of any particular threat. So what we can say from this is there is some significant evidence that he was somebody who should have been looked at continuously, somebody who posed a genuine threat. I think what might have happened is we become, as in the state has become, obsessed about the terrorist threat he posed, because he was looking at Gaddafi potentially, because he was looking at the IRA, because he had an Al-Qaeda manual, although they probably didn't know that at the time. But he clearly had this obsession around that. They, I think, have looked at that as being, well, is he a terrorist? And because he wasn't a terrorist, he's been kind of dismissed as being potentially a threat. And I think that's where the flaw is. And the Prime Minister's talked about, making some changes. I think one of the changes we need to do is kind of move away from our obsession around, is somebody a terrorist? Because you can be an incredibly violent individual, a grievance-driven, violent individual, without any ideology around terrorism. We have seen, and we need to learn from, some of the awful occasions that have happened in the United States, where young men and women, particularly men, have gone on to conduct attacks at their schools. None of those people, or very few of them, are terrorists. They are driven by a deep sense of grievance, of isolation, of exclusion, real or perceived. And I would suggest that in this case, that may be his driving factor. It's important to recognise that doesn't excuse what he's done. He is likely to go to prison for the rest of his life. It may well be they identify some very serious and significant mental health issues with him. which means that he may never be safe to be released. So it doesn't in any way justify or even really explain what he did. But what it does, I think, do is highlight the real benefit of using behavioural assessment and threat management. It highlights why in the UK we specifically need to get a grip of this. We still don't practice this in anywhere near the volume that we do. It is the best methodology for identifying and potentially stopping these particular attacks. It isn't a panacea, it isn't a magic wand, and it isn't someone it's not predictive, it's preventative. But had they applied some of this methodology to this particular individual, they may have come up with different answers. I hope that's of value, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon. Thank you.